Hello and welcome back to my channel, and today I'm celebrating 150 subscribers. Thank you for all your support. Now, it's become a bit of a tradition on this channel that when I reach a landmark like 150, I do a very silly nostalgic video, and this is probably my silliest video. But today I want to welcome you in. This is a safe space, a warm space. You don't have to worry, you don't have to be cool, you don't have to be politically correct. What we're going to do today is look back at that stuff you laughed at when you were a kid, but now you're a little bit embarrassed about. That's right, my friends. If you watched Heidi High when you were a kid, and you laughed at Ruth Maddock going, Mr. Fairbrother, or you laughed at the Punch and Judy man who hated children, so did I laughed. Don't worry, this is the space for you. Now, king of the things we loved as a kid, but now are a bit embarrassed about, is some mothers do have them. Yes, that's right, Michael Crawford with his beret. I remember when I was at school as a kid, you had three impressions that everyone did. Michael Caine, Tommy Cooper, and Frank Spencer. Like, Betty, I've had a bit of trouble. Or Frank Spencer's wife, who I thought was just as good to imitate, Michelle Dautrice going, Frank, what are we going to do, Frank? I loved the series. It was hilarious. It was famous because Michael Crawford was a perfectionist, playing this complete idiot. And he did all his own stunts. So you remember when he was roller skating behind the bus, and he was on top of the church dressed as an angel. And he did all these stunts himself. Some of them were quite dangerous, and he became quite famous for it. And we all laughed. We all loved it. We all waited for that theme music, We loved it, we looked forward to it, and we all thought Michael Crawford was hilarious. Admit it. I still find that scene, when he goes to the RAF, he wants to join the RAF, and Fulton Mackay from Porridge is the RAF officer giving him the aptitude test. And he says to him, now if Fred has one and Helen has two, how many does Jezebel have? And Michael Crawford's reaction is brilliant. He's like, dunno. I love that sequence. I've not been able to find the full sequence for you, but I have put the end of that sequence in one of the links below. All the things I'm going to refer to in this video, I've tried to find links for them, and they're all below, so you can have a good laugh tonight with no one watching. Now, another series that I used to watch with my family was the Les Dawson Show. Remember Les Dawson? Big fat Yorkshire comedian, big bracelets on his arms, telling mother-in-law jokes and using big words to humorous effect. And he used to play the piano really stupidly. I loved that. I thought it was hilarious. But the highlight of the Les Dawson Show was Sissy and Ada. Now, Sissy and Ada was him and Roy Barraclough dressing up as two old Lancashire women. You know that one. And he took it from two things, really. He took it from a comedian from the post-war period called Norman Evans, who had this thing where he used to play this woman leaning over the wall of her neighbour's garden and just chatting. But he also took it from women who worked in Lancashire mills. And because the machinery, the cotton mills, was so noisy, they used to sort of speak to each other, they used to mouth to each other, say, and they take the piss out of this. So what they do is that, so every time they talk about something, they drop their voice like this, which I used to think was hilarious as a kid. So they'd be going something like, do you know Harry next door? He's gone into hospital. He's got a problem with it. He hasn't been able to get it on. And all this sort of thing. I used to howl with laughter at this. And there's a particular Sissy and Ada where they go to an art gallery, and of course there's like a Michelangelo, a naked male statue, and of course they stand admiring it for ages going like this. I still find that funny, and I found a link for it below so you can enjoy it all over again. Another comedian we used to like watching was Frankie Howerd, and Frankie Howerd was always going, no, ooh. Stop it. It's all double entendres, And they kept trying to find vehicles for Frankie Howerd, and they created this thing called Up Pompeii, which is basically like Carry On Roman, basically. And so each episode, he delivers this kind of prologue, this monologue to the audience. And it's all It's very poor material, okay? It's very stupid material, sort of double entendres set in the world of ancient Rome. And all you're watching it for Frankie Howerd and his bits of business. So he'll come on screen and he'll go like, now the Emperor's daughter, erotica, no, who writes this stuff? Well, she's got two things on her mind. I know, her two things on everyone else's mind. Now stop it now. Now, ooh, like this, etc. and etc. Hence, lots of hilarity. I used to love all that stuff. I particularly liked it when he sort of just out of nowhere went, oh, terrible pain, like that for no reason. And you found out later on, it seemed to be all improvised, right? But actually, it was every single beat of it was rehearsed, which somehow makes it even better. But I used to love Frankie Howerd. The material was terrible. It was dreadful. But he was very funny. Another person who was very funny, but is forgotten now, was Kenny Everett. Did you watch the Kenny Everett show? I used to love Kenny Everett. Sid Snot and Gizzard Puke. My two favourites. One was Brotherly Love, who was this gospel preacher, and he had massive hands like this. And he was just going around like that. That was the entire gag. For some reason, I thought it was hilarious. And then there was the American general, who had massive shoulder pads. And he had this catchphrase was, we're going to round them up, put them in a field, and bomb the bastards, which was very funny when I was younger. And then, of course, there was Cupid Stunt. I didn't get that joke for years. I was a very innocent child. Cupid Stunt. How did the BBC let him get away with that? At 8 o'clock in the evening. You remember Cupid Stunt? She was this kind of floozy American actress with big boobs. And, he'd be talking about the plot of some film and he'd be going, and then all my clothes fell off. But I'm telling you the plot. And it's all done in the best possible taste. You remember all this? I used to love that as a kid. And don't pretend you didn't. You watched it as well. You loved it. I know, a bit embarrassing now, right? But we loved it at the time. What else did we like at the time? Do you remember a comedian called Ken Goodwin? There used to be a show on ITV, and it was called The Comedians, and it was like working men's club comedians, end of peer comedians, people like Bernard Manning. And people used to laugh and guffaw at it. I used to like Ken Goodwin. I found a little clip of him below. I think he was from Liverpool, I'm not sure. But he used to have a really interesting style of comedy. He used to go, we're having a good time, aren't we? I'm a laugh riot, me, aren't I? And used to tell really awful jokes, which of course are funnier because he's telling them. And I'm a huge fan of Ken Goodwin. Check him out online. You'll remember him. You will. Do you remember Norman Collier? Do you remember Norman Collier? He was a northern comedian who had one gag. And his one gag was that his microphone didn't work properly. So he'd come on stage and say, hello, I'm Norman... What's happening? That was it. We used to roar with laughter. It was so funny. And then there was, do you remember, the Tea Tray Man? Way back in the day, before Britain's Got Talent, before all these talent shows on television, there was a guy, I think must have been discovered on some show like Opportunity Knocks or something. He was this middle-aged guy, comes out on stage, he looks very sort of, urbane and sophisticated. And then he would sing the Western song Mule Train, and he'd beat out the song with a tea tray on his hip and on his head, banging his head like that. I used to love that. He did it for years. He used to appear on chat shows and variety shows, and God, I loved it. And it was always the same, never changed it, no variation. What a guy. Do you remember watching The Generation Game? I know for most people The Generation Game was Bruce Forsyth, but I have a soft spot for Larry Grayson. Larry Grayson, he was so camp, he was so wonderfully camp. He said, it says here you're a fireman, and every morning you polish your helmet. And cute laughter for hours. It used to make me howl with laughter. I also loved the one where he'd get this marching band on, and he'd put on the helmet, and then he'd turn to the camera and he'd go, as if he was really pleased, and he'd be marching along with the band. That used to have me howling with laughter. They were simple times. Simple times. What else? Being a kid back in the 70s and early 80s, it was great. And the highlight for any child was TISWAS. God, I loved that programme. Saturday mornings on the BBC, you had Multicoloured Swap Shop with Posh Paws. And that was kind of Solid, good children's entertainment. It went on for about 3 hours. But over on ITV, you had the anarchic bad cousin, TISWAS, with loads of adult comedians shamelessly misbehaving themselves. You know, you had that guy with Spit the Dog, which was a puppet that just spat all the time. You had Lenny Henry. Lenny Henry, when he was funny, he was funny. You've forgotten, but he was. Don't deny it. He was funny. When he did his, David Bellamy impressions, boy, lovely undergrowth. And then he would do his impressions of Benny from Crossroads. There's a hilarious skit that I found where he has Benny from Crossroads and him next to each other, and it says, "Spot the real Benny." You couldn't do that now, but it's very funny. I remember when he used to take the piss out of Trevor McDonald, and he also had this character, he used to play this Jamaican guy who's come over to live in England, and he hates England really, but the only thing he likes is condensed milk. And he used to have condensed milk sandwiches. I love it. And of course, TISWAS also had Frank Carson, who I think was a Northern Irish comedian. And he had this fantastic laugh. And he'd go, "The way I tell him, it's the way I tell him." And he used to have me in stitches. There's a very funny scene where they sit Frank Carson down in the studio, and just through him making silly noises and laughing, he has to make everyone else laugh. It's a bit staged, but it's quite funny. There was Compost Corner, the Phantom Flanflinger. You know it. You loved it as much as I did, don't deny it. I bet you also watched Rentaghost, didn't you? Yeah, you did. Children's BBC in the afternoon, you watched Rentaghost. Timothy Claypole. There was Sue Nichols, who was later in Coronation Street, Mrs. Popoff. "These spooks, I must get away from them and pop off." You remember that? Yes, I do too. The pantomime horse, who touched a little hoof to its nose and disappeared. My favourite, actually, was the guy who played Mr. Meeker, who I think was in charge of the Rentaghost agency, a wonderfully over-the-top actor. He always was, actually, played by Edward Brayshaw. "These spooks." I used to really like him. He used to make me laugh. Don't pretend you didn't watch Rentaghost. You did. It's okay. This is a safe space. We can talk about this stuff. I know what you also liked. You also liked Rod Hull and Emu, didn't you? Come on, Rod Hull and Emu were hilarious. For those people who don't know, Rod Hull was an Australian comedian. He came over to Britain. And he really had one act. And that is that he had this sort of glove puppet in the shape of an Australian emu bird. So it would be like this. And it was all very friendly when you started talking to him. And then suddenly it would turn on you. You'd suddenly see its head go like that. And then it would sort of go... And then it would just attack whoever it was talking to. I'm sure Rod Hull had some kind of problem. You know, he wanted to attack people live on television. And we all loved it as a family, didn't we? We thought it was hilarious. Famously, he attacked Michael Parkinson. When I was a kid, whenever they showed highlights of television through the years, they always showed that clip. And I found it for you below. It's still funny. And you used to wait for Emu to get angry. You know, he'd sort of go like that and then attack people. Still makes me laugh. I'm sure Rod Hull had some kind of hostile hand syndrome, but he got away with it for years. But then he died adjusting his TV aerial. He fell off the roof. Talking of animals, there was Basil Brush. Do you remember Basil Brush? Mr. Roy. Boom, boom. I used to love Basil Brush. My favourite toy as a kid was a toy Basil Brush. And one day, it was about my 4th birthday party, I'd left it on the electric fire and his face burnt off. And my mum put a blue patch on his face, even though his fur was brown. Took me ages to get over that. But still, I love Basil Brush. And then we're going deep into embarrassment territory here, but you're safe, don't worry. Did you watch Roland Rat on TVAM in the 80s? You did, didn't you? With Kevin the Gerbil? Rat fans, you watched it. You watched it. It's okay, don't worry. You're safe. What else did we watch? Did you watch It's a Knockout? Do you remember It's a Knockout? It was this stupid game show where people would dress up in silly costumes and try and go and collect something up a slide or something. And it was a sort of family show. And it was Europe-wide. So sometimes they'd have European teams competing against each other. I went to see It's a Knockout live in the town square at Newark-on-Trent on a very grey, rainy day. It was a highlight of my childhood. Of course, nowadays, we know that the presenter of It's a Knockout, Stuart Hall, he's been done for historic sex offences. So no one talks about it anymore. It's kind of verboten. But at the time, the reason why you watched It's a Knockout, it was a terrible programme. But the reason why you watched the programme was because Stuart Hall, every so often, would just burst out laughing. And he had this very infectious laugh. So he'd be going, the Northampton team's going up the slugger! Like this. And it would just go on for hours. And that's why you watched it, because it was really funny. I found a clip online of him. He's doing Les Jeux Sans Frontières, the European version. And it's just basically, it's these people dressed as penguins trying to collect pails of water. And all you can hear is Stuart Hall laughing his arse off. It's hilarious. You know, okay, he's a bad guy and he's in prison, but it was funny back then, let's be honest. What else have we got here? I think I've covered everything. I've done the Tea Tray Man. I wanted to get him in because he's so funny. Well, I think I've covered everything that I loved as a kid, but I was slightly embarrassed about now. But before we go, we have to talk about it, don't we? The most embarrassing thing we enjoyed back then. You know what I'm talking about. The Benny Hill Show. Yes. Our family watched it as well, and we loved it. We thought it was hilarious. You know, many years ago, I was in a bargain basement DVD store, and I saw this for £1.50, and I bought it. I bought it because I was intrigued. Would I watch this and feel horrified and offended by it, as I'm supposed to now? Because, of course, in the 1980s, the alternative comedians took against Benny Hill, and feminists and sort of right-thinking people said it was right to hate him. And ever since, he's been completely ostracised. You know, he was abandoned by his own production company, ITV, and his programmes have never been repeated on television. They are the utmost in bad taste. And I was intrigued. Would I still find it funny, or would I be offended by it? It was a sort of social experiment. I put it on the DVD player. Now, I have to be honest, a lot of the linking material, you know, the sort of all that stuff, I found it very dated and quite hard to sit through. But you know what? As a kid, I loved the silent movie sequences with the silly music and everyone speeded up and all the daft sound effects. And watching it again as an adult, it still made me smile. I still thought some of the gags were brilliant. He nicks most of them off Charlie Chaplin and Buster Keaton. But it's worth mentioning here that when Charlie Chaplin died, in his estate in Switzerland, they found many, many tapes of Benny Hill. He was an admirer of Benny Hill, really liked him. And many people did like him back in those days. We're not supposed to say that now. But he was hugely popular in Britain, hugely popular in America. I think he was the most successful British comedian in America ever. And I sometimes, you know, I feel sorry for Benny Hill. You know, I understand why people didn't like it, but, you know, it's so silly and so innocent. To be massively offended by it seems strange to me. And after all, part of the joke of Benny Hill was that these men chasing women around were all middle-aged. They're all really ugly with weird faces. Like, you know, the little old bloke with the bald head who he keeps slapping. And every so often you keep cutting to that man and he's going, which I still find funny. And I just feel that to be offended by it is somehow worse than to be amused by it, really. It's such stupid, innocent fun. Ah, well. That's my trip down memory lane. Stuff I enjoyed when I was a kid. I look back now and it's pretty mediocre, I suppose. It's a bit silly, but I enjoyed it. And I know you did too. Thanks very much.